We welcome you to our Saturday Kallah, where whatever the weather is, wherever you are, it's our spring Kallah. Our guest speaker is Sue Mylan Reingold, and we are honored to have her parents in Salt Lake participating. There they are, waving. It's great. Sue grew up in Madison and was a member of Temple Bethel with her family. She even got married at Temple Bethel. She received her undergrad degree from UW-Madison in Russian and Hebrew languages. She spent her junior year abroad at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and she will explain her further degree in graduate work at the National Security Studies from Georgetown. Her professors, may be kind of well known. You might know them when she talks about that. Sue worked as a federal government employee for 35 years, including jobs at the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, Commerce, various positions in the U.S. Intelligence community. And during her government service, she worked directly with the White House, and even more incredibly, under both Republican and Democratic administrations. She also spent a year at as a visiting fellow at a DC think tank and a nonprofit private sector company. She retired from federal service in 2014 at the level of senior executive after spending most of her career in the nexus of national intelligence, technology, public safety, security, with the highest level of security clearance. I know the joke is when we would visit and talk to Sue, we couldn't ask what she did or she'd have to kill us. During that time, she gained a diverse executive experience in policy development and management and coordination of terrorism-related information sharing, cybersecurity, intelligence, infrastructure protection issues at the national, state, and local levels. Now, what I think is great is she credits her early years as a founding member of Temple Bethel Youth Group, as a Nafti song leader, and her voice is spectacular, by the way, and a board member and a staff member at Osrui. These experiences and opportunities later helped develop a solid professional foundation for leadership positions in many, many, many positions, including troubleshooting in national security and public safety issues. And it required working together with lots of different people. Currently, she lives in Silver Spring, Maryland with her husband, Lester. Hi, Lester, who's there? Where she enjoys music, theater, art, reading, baking, volunteer work, learning foreign languages on Duolingo, having fun with the New York Times daily spelling bee. All right. Jennifer, you want to talk about how we're going to handle questions?
Hey, everybody. So you can type, we're going to save questions for the end, but you can type them in. Because if you're like me, you won't remember the question when it comes to the end. You can go ahead and type them into the chat, and I'll just sort of be keeping a record, and there could be, duplicate questions and stuff. So you can either wait until the end and raise your hand, or you can type them in, and I'll sort of help, read the questions to Sue and sort them out that way. So whichever, but because it's hard, obviously over Zoom, we'll let Sue do her piece. And I don't know if Linda, have we talked about timing and how long we'll leave for questions and that kind of thing?
The plan is that Sue will have between a 30-45 minute presentation now, or that will take over. And then we can do 15 minutes on for questions and answers afterwards.
Sounds good.
And everybody will be muted, including me, except for Sue and Jennifer. And now we welcome Sue Mylan Reingold.
Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. And thank you, Linda, for such a nice introduction. I hope that we'll have an interesting discussion today. I have to say, I'm not really used to talking about myself, but I'll try to paint a picture of how, I guess the way I look at it, I went from being a fairly confident but very shy, Jewishly active introvert to someone who ended up taking on leadership positions in the national security establishment. And I can't stress enough that all along, none of it was really planned. I didn't have some, long 10-year whatever plan. It kind of happened. As Linda said, I grew up in Madison. I was the second of 4 girls, and a member of Bethel until I moved to the DC area in 1979. I mentioned I graduated from West High School, and that was in 1975. And I chose Russian then as my foreign language because my grandfather was from Kiev, from Ukraine. And it just felt like that was a little bit closer to home than taking something else. Interestingly, in my last year at West, a number of mothers from Bethel and perhaps from Beth Israel as well, actually got the University of Wisconsin to bring in Hebrew 101 first semester Hebrew to offer it on site at West High School. And so we had a full class of kids. So that was also interesting. So, I started formally Russian and Hebrew in high school. And I ended up graduating high school in 3 years because frankly, I had enough credits. Most of my friends were a year older. And at the time, I just really wanted to move on to college. So I attended UW-Madison from 1975 to 1979. And because I liked languages, I decided to major in Russian and Hebrew, but with a degree in secondary education. I also, as Linda mentioned, spent my junior year abroad at the Hebrew University. And that was in 1977-78. And I was actually on the street with the rest of the country when Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, drove by on his way to the Knesset. It was very historic because the president of Egypt had never visited Israel. So that was pretty exciting. Another little thing that happened while I was in Israel, since I was a Russian major, I was actually taking 3rd year Russian. And I have to say it was a very confusing experience. And I don't know why, but I still have my notes from the class. And I don't know how I survived because Hebrew was kind of the default language. You're in a foreign language class and you want to ask a question in English. Well, it was all in Hebrew. And so my notebook is full of Russian words only translated into Hebrew as opposed to English. So when I got back and started in my 4th year of Russian at Madison, I had to kind of reorient myself to what do some of these words mean and how do I go forward. But so it was really fun and interesting experience. I did then get later on my master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown University. I did that in 1988 when I was working, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in more detail. Music, and let me just shift a little bit. Music was always a really big part of my life. When I was younger, I took piano lessons. I liked to sing in choir. I played the violin. My dad made sure that I took part in the Wisconsin Junior Youth Symphony Orchestra, and I also learned guitar. And so music really factored in a major way into how I identified as a Jew and the opportunities I focused on at the time, much of it through Temple Bethel. Couple other things as I was growing up, I turned out to be the second girl who ever had a bat mitzvah at Bethel. And I had to specifically ask for it. I had to request because it wasn't at the time naturally offered to girls. And that was, I think, about 1971. Even though there was a regular bar mitzvah class for the boys. So that was kind of, it was a special thing for me to be able to do. When I was in college, I also did a lot of other things involved at the temple, like teaching midweek Hebrew classes. I don't know if you still have that or not, as well as Sunday school music. Then again, as Linda mentioned, I returned to Madison to get married at Bethel, as did other members in my family over the years. In 9th grade, it's really a turning point relative to Bethel and how I started to grow up. And that was when Rabbi Steve Barrick came to Madison, and he introduced the congregation and all of us kids to the concept of youth group and the National Federation of Temple Youth and the Northern Federation of Temple Youth, which Bethel belongs to. And the thing about the TYG, the Temple Youth Group, is that, at least for me, it was almost like magic to me, especially through Jewish learning and music and the really good friends I made. And really important, the influence of Debbie Friedman, who actually became my first mentor. She picked up on my interest in music. She was kind of our Nofty song leader when I started. And she introduced me to the concept of song leading, which, looking at my career, is essentially leadership through song. So I went through the process of, again, Linda mentioned, I was involved in the youth group, I was on the board, I was a Nofty song leader. And all of that, particularly the song leading, was really under the tutelage of Debbie Friedman. And it was a very special time for me. I also spent several summers at Olin Sang in Oconomowoc, starting in high school as part of what's called the Avodah Corps, which is a camp support work unit. And then as a counselor, and always while I was there as a song leader. I was also hired on weekends during college to be a song leader, and it was primarily for Chicago synagogue groups that went up to camp. And sometimes I would just go up on a weekend and be camp staff, because it was really easy to catch that Badger bus that was nearby campus. And then I don't even remember what stop I got off, but someone would pick me up at some stop, which seemed like it was in the middle of nowhere off the highway, right by the cornfields. And so I did that many a weekend. So ironically, and just to include a little bit of Jewish geography, on one of those weekends when I did song leading, there was a fairly young rabbi from Skokie that I song led with. And he introduced me at the time to his fiance, whose name was Debbie. Okay, and I'm not sure why I remember this, but when I met my husband a few years later, it somehow came up that this very same Debbie had been my husband's longtime girlfriend in high school and college. And so, I mean, it was just the coincidence. Again, it was really something, but all four of us became and remained very good friends. So I didn't realize it at the time, but all of these youth group and camp activities really were opportunities to develop a solid foundation for future leadership positions in my professional life. So when I started talking to you, I mentioned that I really didn't have any plans looking forward. I like languages and the arts and got a teaching degree as a backup, even though I knew that I really didn't want to teach high school language classes. But I did know that I wanted to move somewhere new and interesting. So when two friends in my Russian class at the university told me that this federal agency called the National Security Agency was recruiting on campus, we all went for an interview. Now, there was very little public information at the time about this government agency. And since all its work was classified and there was no internet at the time, shocking, but it's true, there really wasn't much to research in advance. So when I got to the actual interviews, they weren't very illuminating either. And to top it off, my resume had very little in it that probably was relevant other than I knew Russian. So they were at the time looking for Russian linguists. And I looked at it as a chance to move somewhere new and use a foreign language. So I accepted a job offer at $13,000, a $13,000 starting federal salary, which is what you got at the time, kind of as a starting salary when you had an undergrad degree. And so in the summer of 1979, I took off on a road trip with my parents, who went with me and helped me move to Washington, D.C. So my very first job was to work as a Russian linguist with a high-level security clearance. Now, just as a general comment, I just want to note, because that it was actually far more unusual at that time to be a woman in the national security and national intelligence fields than it was to be a Jew, because there are a lot of Jewish people, there are a lot of Jews working in this area. So the minority that I was part of was being a woman. That's changed today, but at the time, it definitely was the case. So I can't go into too much detail about the specifics of the first job, other than just to give you a little bit of background. The National Security Agency, their job is to collect something called signals intelligence. And that's information that's being sent electronically through the air, but to collect from international, not domestic sources. So what I was doing is I was listening to people speaking in Russian, identifying what sounded important, and typing out a transcript in Russian on a Russian English keyboard. And that information, so then what happened is that information went to analysts at places like the CIA, where they combined it with more information from other sources and produced what is referred to as intelligence reports that go to senior government policymakers and also the president, like in the president's daily brief. So if I were to use an example from today's current events, the end result of the information chain that people like me started when we were doing those transcripts would end up with the government officials that you see or hear on the news telling reporters recently that the intelligence community had been tracking the fact that Putin was preparing for war on Ukraine for some time. Or that information, would make its way to things like recent congressional hearings with officials from the intelligence community, where they were talking about what they know or can project about what may happen with Russia and Ukraine. So the things I listened for and in later jobs wrote reports about ultimately resulted in information conveyed to US government, senior policymakers, and the president. The subject matter I was assigned at the time focused on Soviet science and technology, because there was still a Soviet Union at the time. So it was the first time that, as a liberal arts person, because that's how I saw myself coming out of college, I realized that technology issues were really interesting. That first job changed my whole perspective on the type of job I might be interested in next. So let me digress for just a minute, because it might be interesting to talk about and explain a little bit what's a security clearance, because it usually seems like a bit of a mystery to most people. So interestingly, unless you're the president or certain members of Congress who actually are automatically given access to classified information due to the nature of their job, everyone else has to go through a very lengthy vetting process to be given a national security clearance. And the ones at the highest level, it costs the government about $4,000 to $5,000 per person they spend to go through this process. So it's an investment. So the higher the clearance, the more intense the process. And it includes filling out mountains of forms, going through a comprehensive background check, and then security agents going out to interview you, as well as people you know, friends, neighbors, colleagues. I remember, because I was coming out of college, the first time that I was being reviewed for a security clearance, I was really surprised when some of my colleagues in the Russian department at the UW kind of whispered to me that they were approached by some guys in suits and trench coats, and they were asking about me. And it was like, who knew that sort of thing actually happened? But there it was. So when you look at clearances, a person's clearance level is actually based on whatever increasingly sensitive level of information your job requires for you to do. So information is labeled either confidential, secret, or top secret. That's kind of the three main categories. The classified information itself gets classified actually not by its content necessarily, by how it was obtained, i.e. how sensitive the sources and methods that were used to obtain it. And how much protection is needed to keep those sources and methods secret. Which is kind of different than most people think. Oh, there's some piece of paper and it's classified because of what it says. Well, it's classified more because of how someone obtained it. So classified information is tagged based on the level of secrecy needed to protect the sources and methods by which the information was obtained. And being granted a top level clearance is based on full confidence by the government in the integrity of the person being given the clearance. So I'm explaining it because I hope it's somewhat interesting. And I guess the other thing is that the rest of my career really resulted from my having a clearance as a requirement of my job. It opened up many, many opportunities, because when it comes down to it, not that many people across the government actually have a top level clearance or an understanding of the intelligence community. So after coming out in 1979, I actually spent the next 20 years employed by the National Security Agency. And since it had thousands of people, employees with a multitude of skills, I was actually able to find many jobs that involved things I had never done but could learn. Things like cybersecurity, international relations. I was a liaison, primary liaison with between NSA and its counterpart in the UK. I did congressional liaison, and I was even an executive officer for one of the deputy directors. I got to spend several months living and working on a US Army base in Germany, and had a lot of other overseas travel. One of my favorite experiences was actually pulling together a trip to Korea, Thailand, and Japan for my boss, who was one of the NSA's 4 deputy directors. And I was able to accompany him on that trip. So one of our days in Korea, they put us in like 6 of us or so. Anyhow, we got in a large helicopter, side doors open, and we flew from Seoul, Korea, South Korea, all the way up to the demilitarized zone, which is the no man's land between South and North Korea. And there I was in a dress and stockings, which women actually wore stockings and almost had to at the time. When we got up to the demilitarized zone, I found myself, and my boss was in a 3-piece suit as well, running down this steep, slippery, muddy path in very hot weather to see, and down deep, to see a closed off tunnel that the North Koreans had actually dug under the demilitarized zone. I mean, and there continue to be many of those tunnels today. Again, it was a way if they thought they wanted to invade. So it was a very interesting experience. I can only be glad I was wearing flat shoes at the time. And also, I don't know, any of you like Korean food or have ever tried Korean food? Because there I was the same trip afterwards in a big tent on a South Korean army base, having bibimbap for lunch with the soldiers. So it was quite an experience. NSA also had an excellent school, and they offered a lot of leadership and management training, and even special courses that were tailored to women, addressing leadership and empowerment in the workplace. It was very unusual compared to other agencies, the sorts of things they offered, and I made sure to take advantage of it all. NSA, at the time, there was a lot more money in the budget, I think, than today, but they also paid for graduate education. So as long as I could justify that a course was work-related over a period of 2 years and working regular hours during the day, I scrambled down to DC at night to take evening courses. And this was at Georgetown University. So actually I was able to, while working, complete a master's degree in national security studies. And that particular program was geared towards working people. So people basically professional that might already be in the field, working national security issues. And so the courses were offered both at the University at Georgetown and also in various conference rooms in the Pentagon. And they did that because it was easily accessible on public transportation for both the students and the instructors, all of whom, had some of them very high level and active positions, high profile people in government and the private sector as well. And I think one of the professors I actually remember the most, and yes, people like Madeline Albright and others taught courses, and it was very interesting. But I had a course on Poland and Germany during World War II with a man named Jan Karski. And I don't know if you've heard of him, but he became very famous. He was a Polish diplomat and a resistance fighter as well. And he actually came to the US early on to try to tell FDR about what was going on in Nazi Germany. And so it was quite an experience to have him there in person telling us that story. So those are the sorts of things I was able to also experience while getting a graduate degree. So as I became more experienced, NSA selected me for an executive leadership development program. And as part of that, we were required to put together a development plan, identify courses we needed to take to improve our skills, but also a schedule of future job assignments. So I decided, okay, I've done a bunch of things at NSA. I want to do something outside of NSA. So I chose to actually find and create year-long jobs that were outside of the government. And NSA, I don't know how I convinced them, but I did, that they would actually, pay my salary, but loan me out to a think tank called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I was a visiting fellow there. And then I had met a woman a CEO who ran a nonprofit company. And she said, well, why don't you spend a year being my senior advisor? And so I was able to have those sorts of opportunities. So going after unusual jobs outside of your agency was not what people did at that time. Most people wanted to stay at NSA, and they used the phrase, they wanted to stay close to the flagpole in order to be recognized and get promoted sooner. But other more unusual opportunities were really more attractive to me. So for these outside assignments, I networked with people I had met. And as I mentioned, I found these jobs for myself. And then I had to get permission to actually go out and do these jobs for executive development. They were really very eye-opening, and they helped me to see my strengths in running and managing things versus just focusing on the analytics of being an in-depth subject matter expert. And that was a really important distinction at the time for me to kind of understand. I wanted to go more to management and that sort of thing. So just a little bit, you may wonder what a think tank is and what a visiting fellow might actually do. Well, think tanks are nonprofit organizations, and in Washington, D.C., they analyze various subjects of interest primarily to the US government. They write papers, they host discussions. They serve as talking heads on news programs. If you watch the news, I'm sure you see people saying, they're from this organization or another. So in fact, or people at think tanks, at these organizations, they are in-depth subject matter experts and academics, which I just said was not my thing. So what was I doing there? Well, I was fortunate because the director of the Center for Strategic and National Studies, who was a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, his name was John Hamry, he actually recognized I was more of a doer and asked me to help him write a grant application and set up a partnership with several other national organizations and put together what's called a tabletop exercise, literally because it's done in a room around a table, that would play out what the US might do if there was a bioterrorism attack. And this was prior to 9/11. People were thinking ahead. The exercise was called Dark Winter, and it involved former high-level US officials to play the part of the president, like former Senator Sam Nunn was the president, and to play cabinet members, state governors, the National Guard. Plus we had actual reporters to play the press as well. And we ended up briefing the results directly to Vice President Cheney at the White House, which was kind of fun, something that I got to do. And that was really an experience I wouldn't ever have dreamed of having. And as I mentioned, this was all just prior to 9/11. On 9/11, on that day, I barely missed actually being at the Pentagon. I had planned to go that morning to an NSA, a very small NSA office there in the Pentagon, where I've used that office sometimes to go, because I was working in Virginia and it was on the way, and I would go and read my classified email there. But I was running late that morning, and I had the radio on and I heard the news, and I basically didn't, like many other people, didn't go into work that day. So that was fortunate. So as 9/11 happened, I was finishing NSA's executive development program and those other different jobs I had. And I just realized that NSA it seemed like to me that it was just too insulated. And I had been doing a lot of other things outside. So the rest of the government was out there, and there was a lot of opportunity to learn new things. So finally, I managed to get NSA to agree to let me go away one last time to a small office called the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office. And it was a small place that reported directly to the Secretary of Commerce and to the White House cybersecurity advisor. And its job was to set up partnerships between federal and state governments and the private sector for what they referred to as all hazards threat identification, warning, and then mitigation if something happened, particularly via cyber means an attack, to infrastructure like oil, gas, electric, financial, water, banking, healthcare, communications, all the things that we all depend upon day to day. And something that everyone's particularly worried about today with potential Russian cyber attacks. So the point was to make sure that there were and are plans in place so that all of these industries keep the country running, maintain their capabilities, and don't go down. So this office was ultimately absorbed into what became the Department of Homeland Security, which was established in 2003. So the new department, with its Secretary Tom Ridge, they needed experienced employees to set it up. And because of my intergovernmental and private sector experience, I was actually asked to come and help set up the department's headquarters operation, in particular in a place called the Office of State and Local Government Coordination. So every element of that headquarters, the Department of Homeland Security, just because of timing, was heavily populated by George W. Bush political appointees, many of whom had helped with his recent election. And so I had always, and had been my whole career, what is known as a career government employee. And that's an employee who's apolitical and keeps the government knowledge base in place when the White House and federal departments usually change leadership every 4 years. So I can say that this is where I learned up close about political appointees. I was really fortunate that these political appointees with whom I worked were all very competent. And everyone was there to make to make the country a safer place. They were there for public service. And so I really liked what I was doing there. So after a year, I actually applied and actually had to compete for my own job because I was only on loan. And I was hired as a full-time employee of the Department of Homeland Security. And so I resigned from NSA at that point. It was a really scary time for the country. And so I guess a scary time to set up a new department that was supposed to prepare for a world where international terrorism had arrived within our own borders. I don't know if we can say today that the department as a whole has been a success, but there was some good work done in those early startup days before the bureaucracy set in. I was there as one of the first 300 members of the headquarters as an intelligence expert who could set up new processes to improve terrorism-related information sharing nationwide across federal, state, and local governments. And actually the 4 years that I then spent at Homeland Security were some of my favorite years in government. I was able to travel all over the country, and I met really hardworking government, law enforcement, and public safety officials from every state and major city, and put in a lot of effort together to improve ways to share terrorism-related information, because remember, that's how 9/11 happened. That information didn't get where it needed to go. And we started to set up a network of information sharing centers across the country. I also spent many a late night on the phone with state government officials when the Homeland Security threat level, they used to have this, sometimes went from yellow to orange based on a piece of intelligence, and it was kind of chaotic and a little crazy. They don't have it anymore, but at the time, people were trying to figure out, how to keep the country safe, and so that's what we did. So to step back for a moment, after I'd been doing all of these things, and I looked at it, it all of a sudden occurred to me that I liked startup operations. I liked starting things from the ground up where you could employ creativity and look at new approaches in order to put processes and procedures in place to be effective. So if you think about it, startups inherently have less bureaucracy and old think, and they can therefore move more quickly and effectively. The next jobs I found up until the day I retired from government were all startups of one sort or another. The work I did at Homeland Security then led me to being selected as the deputy director for a new federal-wide government organization for information sharing that was established by Congress. And again, it was an outgrowth of 9/11, and it was established through a law. Most agencies and stuff, there's a law Congress passes to establish the agency. And this one was called the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, a very long title. The act also created a new organization to manage the US intelligence community that was called the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So this new organization, where I was the deputy director, reported both to the White House, to a Homeland Security advisor, and to the director, this new director of national intelligence. So the former career ambassador was the director and I was his deputy. And what we did there is we tried to create what I'll call a neutral space to bring together differing approaches on policy, technology, and kind of business practices of how you do terrorism related information sharing. So again, kind of a continuation of things I've been doing. So I managed the daily work of a staff of about 60, dealt with the Homeland Security staff at the White House just about daily, held tons of meetings, and moderated a lot of discussions and joint activities, again, among government, law enforcement, public safety, the intelligence community, as well as privacy and civil liberties communities. Because at that point, when you're looking at what's going on, international terrorism in the US, you have to start to consider issues that have to do with personal privacy and civil liberties. So while I was there, we continued to work at creating that network of terrorism information sharing centers across the country. I also spent a lot of time with congressional oversight committees, because that's where federal agencies get their budgets approved. So it's real important to have a constant back and forth with them so they understand what you're doing. And I even ended up testifying publicly before the Senate Intelligence Committee. There was a lot of public speaking in this job. It was also the first time that I noticed how much more organized Republicans tended to be than the Democrats. So this is not a political statement. I'm just telling you what I observed. So, and it's really my perspective on management and the ability to get more things done when you're organized. So the White House under George W. Bush, and I have to say, especially Vice President Dick Cheney, was tightly managed. And they made their priorities very clear government-wide. So you could see the paths to getting things done. And remember, we all served at the pleasure of the president, no matter if you're political or your career. So I wish it weren't so, but when Obama came in, the White House became much less organized and the national security world seemed more chaotic. it just, again, just giving you my impression. And moving along, while I was no longer in government, it was plain to see that the Trump White House was simply nowhere near as organized as any prior administration. So coming up to the current administration, I obviously don't have firsthand insight into the Biden White House and what it's like, but seeing that he's brought in pretty experienced people, and the press secretary, who's out there all the time, has a great handle on what's going on and the messages that need to be conveyed. It looks like this group of Democrats is very organized. So again, just some of my impressions. Other things just about the White House. There's actually a small bowling alley in the White House. In addition, there's an old, in disrepair, but beautiful tiled swimming pool that's actually underneath the press room where those daily press briefings are held. And the working part of the White House is actually very small. Well, even the Oval Office is somewhat small, but it's, you see the red room, the blue room, you see basically where they hold state dinners and that. But when you actually go to the working area, it's small and it's cramped. And most staff are located next door in a building called the Old Executive Office Building. So one of the various things I did, I was part of an export control working group. And that's just, export control is basically trying to decide what sorts of technology the US should or should not sell, because you don't want to sell things to other foreign countries that could be dangerous to the US. So I was on this export control group, and it was led by the National Security Council, someone at the White House. So one of our team was leaving the country for another job. And so this guy who led the group, who was working at the White House, he reserved the 2-lane bowling alley for our farewell party. So it was very surreal. A bunch of us bowling next to pictures literally of Bess Truman, Lady Bird Johnson, and other past first ladies who had used the bowling alley for parties back in the day. So so there was fun along with the hard work. Just moving ahead to my final job in the government was really the most difficult and challenging startup. And it used everything I had learned, and it was difficult and challenging because there was no staff, no office space, no budget, no office equipment, and literally no plans. There was only vague language in that intelligence reform bill I referred to earlier that directed the creation of something called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. But another problem is that the Senate still needed to confirm the chairman of this organization and the rest of the board members. So I took everything I knew about government and had learned over 35 years and literally used it to pull together the privacy board. And after seeing all the privacy and civil liberties issues related to how the government handled countering terrorism after 9/11, it just seemed to me like it was important to get the board up and running. So I was at a different job. I wanted to move on. I basically decided to put together an outline detailing the things that probably needed to be done to get the organization going. Talked to some people and found out the names and emails of the 2 already confirmed board members of this privacy board. I sent them my outline and I volunteered to help. They ended up replying. They called me, had me in for an interview. They hired me, and I ended up spending my final 2 years in the federal government setting up the civil liberties, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. I was the chief operating officer, and everyone else in there was a lawyer. So the organizational details were truly left to me. It was exhausting, but rewarding. And I was coming up on my eligible retirement date. And at that point really felt like my work was done. So I was ready to leave. So in 2014, I retired from the federal government with 35 years of service, and I really haven't looked back. So if I ask myself whether I made a difference, I would say yes. new administrations come and go with each presidential election, and good programs get undone because new personnel always think they have a better idea. So sometimes success or the impact of an agency or program, some of that can be temporary or fleeting. So what I found really as the most lasting and satisfying impact that I could make in any job was mentoring younger and less experienced employees. Taking the time to share my experiences and to pass on knowledge was actually fun. And it was rewarding to see people's confidence and skills improve. So really I think one thing I learned was to manage and communicate effectively in any capacity as a leader. It's important to give back to others what you've learned. Along the way, I also volunteered for a program, this is outside of government, called the Presidential Classroom, where I can say scary, smart kids from all over the country and the world came to DC for a week to learn what happens there. So I literally took, for several years, I took a week's leave and lived on site with them as a teacher and a group leader. And that was, I don't think the program exists anymore, but I'm sure there are other programs that bring kids to DC. So just to kind of sum everything up, because I know it's been a lot, I decided to make a career out of public service. And so looking back at myself, this introvert learned how to turn on when I needed to, extend myself to others, and then take time to recharge. Because being an extrovert is actually required for many, many jobs. So my career was about looking for and taking advantage of opportunities and being willing to learn and experience completely new ideas and areas of interest. As a result, I was able to get involved in startup operations, state, local government, private sector outreach, problem solving, partnership building, troubleshooting, national security and public safety issues that also required public, community, and congressional engagement. So I took what I realized was a practical streak that I had, a lot of common sense, being open to new things, and attention to detail as necessary, and good organizational and communication skills. And I applied that to every job, regardless of the subject matter of the job. Because I realized that you don't need to prove that you have an in-depth subject matter expertise if you can effectively employ all those skills. I looked for people I could trust and respect and who could teach me, regardless of the subject matter, as people I wanted to work for, work with, utilize as a mentor. And I let go of preconceived notions that allowed me to be open to opportunities I didn't ever think would interest me. So it made for a very rewarding and long career, astonishingly within a single employer, which was the US government. So I think back fondly to growing up in Madison and all that I learned there, and I consider myself very fortunate. So that's about it, and I appreciate all of you listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. So thanks.
Wow, Sue, that's incredible. And I don't know if your parents, Iris and Dan, knew everything you did. I certainly didn't. Wow.
Well, I'd forgotten, it was an interesting exercise when you asked me to do this, to have to think through all of this. So
incredible. But, I see how you said, you took the opportunity and it was unusual for a woman, but you really created, you're self-made, you created your own career, which doesn't seem like what people tend to do. How are you so successful?
I guess because I wasn't afraid to ask if I could do things. And it was for whatever reason, it was a very open environment, at least at the time. And so, and maybe I was convincing. And so I met a lot of people. And I didn't hesitate to call them, talk to them. People would say, are you interested in this job? Or, hey, why don't you come here and do this? And I'll talk to your boss. I mean, a lot of the people I knew were high enough level, they could talk to the director of the agency, or they could, that sort of thing. So part of it was just, I don't know why, but I wasn't afraid to go do that. And believe me, I did have to give up, say, earlier promotion opportunities. I got where I wanted in the end, but it wasn't the same path or direction as other people. And I was willing to do that. It was a little riskier, and a lot of people don't like to take that risk. I don't know why it was okay, but it was, it didn't bother me. What can I say?
Well, you seem to have such great insight too about what you wanted, what you didn't want, what you're not, I think a lot of people can kind of fall into a job and be there, but you did just so curate your own path versus staying close to the flagpole, or however you described it. There are I'll give you some of the questions from the chat, and then we can ask for questions from the group. One question which is actually a question I had, was, as you changed jobs, did you have to, did your security clearance have to continually be re-upped or reevaluated, or how did that work?
Right. So it's not with changing jobs. So basically, they're supposed to reinvestigate you every 5 to 7 years. So as long as the job you go to requires a clearance, you continue to have your clearance. Now, there's a whole security apparatus that transfers, the fact that you have a clearance and verifies it, and it transfers from one agency to another. So that just, goes along with you. But then separately, you have to fill out all the paperwork. You're reinvestigated. They go out and talk to your neighbors, and you actually have to give them references as well. Now, the government got very behind with that. So in some cases, it was every 10 years, as opposed to 5 to 7. And I don't know where they are today, but it transfers. So as long as you know that you're going to a job that requires a clearance, and then there's a whole group of security people who work to send your clearance. And by the way, when you go to a meeting at another agency, and it's a classified meeting, you have to verify you have a clearance. So there's this whole process that can get very screwed up if the information isn't sent. So many times people would arrive at another agency for a classified meeting, and they go, your clearances aren't here. They have to go electronically. It's not like you can carry them with you. So someone has to certify it. And so the solution to that, in many cases, I had a badge for the FBI. I had a badge for the Pentagon. I had a badge. Well, the intelligence community is a badge where you can go into many agencies. And that just let me, it said you have a clearance. It was programmed into my badge so I could get into the buildings.
Wow.
I think part of my question was, you went to CSIS for a bit, which is non-governmental, and then you went back to government. Right. So did your clearance drop off when you went into the private sector?
No, because I was still working for NSA and they paid my salary. So they loaned, everywhere I went, the government loaned me out. So they were paying my salary and I maintained my clearance. And I also, even though I was working at those places, I still had to go back for maintenance of various, duties and things like that. So, so yes, they just you maintain your clearance status while you're doing those other things. Because if I had left, when I resigned from NSA, they basically, they call it, they read you out of your clearances that you have there, and then they transfer the fact that you have clearances to the Department of Homeland Security. So it's kind of complicated, and you really have to understand it to make sure it happens properly and all the paperwork. But as long as you're employed as in paid by the government, your clearance stays with you, and your status stays with you, I think, at least 5 years after you retire, so that if you want to find another job, you still have an active clearance. Does that help? Did that help answer?
No,
that?
I was just curious because our son's sort of following your track, starting with West High and Osroi and on up to and up to DC. And he's been in and out of, a lot of the same agencies we've been in, NSC in the White House and so on and so forth, and it's in CSIS and all that. And it never occurred to me to ask him what happens to you when you filter in and out of these places. So it's very interesting to hear what you had to say.
Oh, okay, yeah. So what happens to, part of it is you make sure that you maintain your clearance. If you want to, you've got to pay attention to that so that you don't end up somewhere where you don't have it anymore. So I just made sure the things I did, I always had my clearance.
It's important.
Can you also explain about the security when you would go to meetings and what you had, why you don't have pictures of people?
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't just meetings. It was, so I worked in what is called, if you ever, sometimes in some shows, it's a SCIF, a secure compartmented information facility. That means that the whole office, it could be a building, it could be an office, it could be a small room in a building, that basically it's set up so that you can basically work with classified information. So I had, in NSA, its whole buildings are that way. In other places, I was in buildings in downtown DC where the floor was, cleared, it's classified. And so there's basically, it's alarmed. There's, a lock on the door, and you cannot take phones. You can't take any electronics in. So if you're going to a meeting or you work in one of those facilities, there are boxes, lock boxes where you put your phone and any type of electronics outside before you go in. And this is everywhere. This is in Congress, they have secure areas. Obviously, the White House, almost every government agency that may handle classified information has at least one small room. So it's a whole procedure. And then when you're inside, you can't just throw things away. They have special bags have to put, they're called burn bags because you put the information in it and then they are taken to literally be disposed of and burned because it's classified information. Your computer systems are separate, completely separate. Your phone, you have a separate phone system that's classified. So it's a whole kind of different world and you have to learn how to operate within it.
Judy has a really good question. What do you think would surprise people to know about Homeland Security?
Would surprise people to know about Homeland Security? That, gosh, today or then, because I'm not as up on Homeland Security today, but maybe I don't know what I'd say will surprise people because I'm not sure what people think of Homeland Security.
Right.
When I was there, it was kind of I'll use the word benevolent, agency in terms of it was just getting its footing. Today, you've got TSA as part of Homeland Security, border control is part of Homeland Security. Maybe here's what may surprise you. Secret Service is part of the Department of Homeland Security. And there's all sorts of things that Secret Service does besides just protective detail of the president and others. And the Secret Service for many years actually tracked electronic crimes.
Mm-hmm.
So, there were things I learned. It was like, oh, I had no idea you did that. So I guess some people would be surprised at how big it is. That's probably it's huge. It is huge. And it encompasses a lot of different skill sets and a lot of different subjects and things, not all of which they don't need to be part of Homeland Security, but it was created that way. So I would imagine it'll change in future years. So
interesting. Another question from Niles. So the idea of, how the workings of government have been sort of attacked recently is the deep state. And so with your career-long devotion to public service with so many positive impacts that you've had, how do you react to these persistent attacks on the deep state?
With sadness. So those existed when I was working as well. They weren't as prevalent because people weren't given permission to, voice themselves in such a way. But I'm sure it has an effect on people going into public service, and it certainly has an effect on people who are working really hard, just to, it may sound corny, but honest to goodness, serve the American people. Look, the government, like anywhere else, has, waste. It has people who don't do their jobs all the time and things like that. But I guess one of my pet peeves, a little bit of a soapbox, is that we all wake up in the morning confident that we're going to wake up in the morning in a free country, be able to get up and do what we want to do. And the only reason is because there's a military out there who's protecting us all over the world. There are, government workers who are keeping things going that we just take it, for granted every day. And that's not just at the federal level, it's, at our local and state levels as well. So, yeah, so I find it, my reaction is, I think it's very sad that there's this whole world of people who talk about, are very paranoid and talk about the deep state. So that's, I guess, my reaction.
Yeah, and I'm just the cynicism of your intents, you meaning like the government, but it's just that I'm just struck by the, right, this is a dedication of public service. Jane has a good question that with all the news about ripping up documents lately, I'm surprised that they seem to be talking about paper copies. Are there not electronic copies of everything?
So yes, there are definitely electronic copies of everything. And I have to say that like the daily reporting I was talking about and the president's daily brief, all that stuff is electronic. Okay. But, maybe you wouldn't be surprised at how many people, particularly of a certain age, prefer paper. And so, you have a president who only wanted paper. He wasn't going to look at stuff online. Trump only wanted paper. Obama probably did both. I don't, in terms of when you're traveling, sometimes it's easier to have a sheaf of papers you can pull out than trying to look at something. The other thing is, particularly if you're traveling and moving along, you need a secure device to read, classified information on. So sometimes it's easier just to have a briefcase full of papers, but there's a lot of paper out there. People, they continue to print a lot of paper. What can I say? Even though everyone has, they have a desktop computer, oftentimes they have two screens because you have one for your unclassified and one for your classified. So people have definitely transferred over to a digital world, but that digital world is still full of paper.
Yeah, I think that's true in every industry. Niles and Linda are asking, do people that you work with know of your musical talents in your way to getting things done?
I think some people did. It just depended upon, we didn't have any music stuff going on at work, but yeah, it just depended on how well you knew someone and what, what they knew about you. But yeah, I had plenty of people where we knew each other's personal lives and things like that, but it didn't really, I guess it didn't really come up in the regular course of talking to people.
So
go ahead, Sue.
I do have a question back when you were talking about classified documents, because you talked about burn bags to put classified documents in. And yet I was under the impression that most documents had to either go to the National Archive or they go to a future presidential library, but they'd be accounted for and not destroyed. And I know for years I was taking an advocate group from Wisconsin to DC to meet with all of our elected representatives because we were trying to get legislation through to be certain that all the things that were put on computers, technological at the beginning of that whole era, were being saved because so many agencies were deleting the older versions when a new version or new information came forth. And so we're trying to be very careful to make sure for historical and precedent purposes that things were retained. And yet you were talking about a burn bag for classified information. So that was a surprise to me.
Well, so you're absolutely correct. So when I'm referring to the burn bag, and that's kind of for people, I mean, most of us, it's a copy of an official record that is there. Okay. So that when I read something or write something, or, you know, I print it off to look at it, or even, I mean, there are documents that you put together yourself. So yes, we all know that we have to save official records, and those are generally saved digital. Okay, you know, nowadays, because you basically have them on a computer. But when you're printing off things like that and what you're working on every day, that stuff gets thrown out because it's not the original record. All right, so people, so what I'm talking about getting thrown away are things that are not the original record. I just cannot vouch for what we heard about President Trump and some of those documents, because they could very well have been original documents. But everyone, you know, when you work for the government, you are basically, you know, well aware of the Presidential Records Act. You're well aware of needing to keep records and make sure, and particularly, so the White House is even, you know, more different because they have to freeze the records. Like when one administration is leaving and the next one's going there, they literally have to, their records get saved and put away, and nothing is saved for the next administration. Like when they come in, it wasn't like there are documents sitting there for them. That stuff is all put away as far as, and their records of the previous administration. And so, yeah, so there are lots of rules and people understand. That's not to say that there are, you know, times when people don't do what they should do. So it's good to have oversight.
No, it's very good. Our son was called into the Obama administration at the end of his, several months before the end of the administration, to help determine what should go to his future presidential library, what should go to the National Archive, what should be done, how these things should all be redistributed, which is major decision making. But it was interesting because then you hear the opposite after Trump, where he was carrying cartons home with him, you know, which is kind of bizarre, or ripping them up and flushing them down the toilet. So I just, yeah, there's lots of things that go on that I don't even know if we'll all ever know about, but.
Well, that's probably true. And you know, it was law of the jungle, okay, in that White House. And all I can tell you, again, just based on my experience, I, you know, never seen anything like it. And that was never allowed to happen. But you have to remember, there was a chief of staff at the White House who made sure that things were done. That's their job, to make sure things are done properly and to manage things. And again, when you have law of the jungle, you're not tracking anything. And when people are looking out for themselves, I'm talking about staff and everyone, like, you know, and if you're afraid to talk to your boss and tell them what they need to be doing, that goes out the window. And I don't know how you enforce something like that. It's breaking the law, but there's presidential privilege. And so from a legal perspective, how's that determined and who determines it? So lots of, you know, questions, good questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'll ever see.
It'll be interesting to go through the future presidential libraries, because right now you go through and you see documents and you see tangible things, and so much is digital now. It'll be interesting to see how we have access to that.
There's here's a question from the chat, and I don't know if you can actually answer this question, but when you were listening to conversations in Russian, so back to your early job there, did you hear about threats to national security, or was it more likely that you would hear about tech-related development by the Russians or threats of stealing intellectual property of US corporations?
So what I was doing, remember, I was like a, you know, entry-level government employee. So at the time, and this is what I was assigned, was strictly, it was geared only to the Soviet science and technology industry. And so it was day-to-day stuff. And frankly, most of what I did fed into analysts who would take the information and then decide how far along is the Soviet Union in certain technologies, and therefore do we need to restrict exporting certain things so that they can't get ahead or reverse engineer them or whatever it may be. So there were different, there are always different people tracking different subjects and different things. And so, as you can hear on the news that there's information that, the intelligence community picked up that there was a threat. Well, that's sources and methods that you don't talk about, however they picked it up. You're not going to hear that. You're going to simply, you may hear what the actual information is. The other thing I'll just point out, because most people don't realize this, but it's something, if you have a clearance, you have to be aware of, is that just because something is reported in the newspaper doesn't mean it all of a sudden becomes unclassified, because classified information is reported. And so if you have a clearance, you have to still treat it as such. So many times, sometimes you'll hear I can't confirm or deny something, that's because it's probably classified and you can't confirm or deny it. So it makes for interesting times.
The other question in the chat is about sort of then, what would you advise to a college student, a young person who wants to follow in your career path?
Well, I'm not sure what my career path was. So, from the standpoint of if someone wants to go into government or they want to go into the intelligence community. So I guess what I'd advise nowadays, you can check so much more out in terms of things are online and you can read a lot more. I guess what I would say, if someone thinks they might be interested, look for an internship. Even intelligence community agencies have internships now, summer internships. And this isn't just for people like me who started out with a liberal arts education. Places, they hire engineers during the summer. They hire mathematicians, they hire people from all sorts of different career fields. So I would say to someone, try something out, see what you think might be interesting. And because you can read so much now about different agencies in different places, just familiarize yourself, but take advantage of all the opportunities that weren't there when I was younger. So I had to create them, and a lot of them are there now to apply for and try them.
That's really interesting that, right, you were self-made, you really had to put that together for yourself.
Yeah. And after I did, in many cases, it became a de facto thing. That visiting fellow thing. Now NSA sends a visiting fellow.
Yeah, that's such a really smart model, and you just created these new models for doing things. So that's really, just that creative thinking, and like I said, sort of knowing what you think is a good idea and what you want. Carol is asking this is more political question, like at the staffer level, do the Democrat and Republican staff people talk to each other? Or are they as partisan as the, outward facing people?
Are you talking about in Congress?
I'll let Carol ask the question if she's
or in the government. I mean, in the federal.
It just says at staffer level.
Okay, so within federal agencies, we don't talk about, okay, political appointees, what they are because what party the president is, but people don't talk politics in federal agencies because there's something called the Hatch Act where you're supposed to be apolitical, and even the political appointees. Now, sometimes they find it a little bit hard, but they can talk to each other and do things that promote, the president and whatever the values are. But like at NSA, no, there's nothing. The director is actually a 3-star military general or admiral. And so there's nothing at the time, okay? At the time, there was nothing political. My dad sent me an article this morning about these intelligence community bulletin boards where people are talking and stuff. And apparently there's a lot of white supremacist, pro-Trump remarks and stuff that's on a public government system that would never have happened when I was in the government, and that should be, they would have shut it down. So that's kind of in the government. You just don't see that. People don't talk politics really. On Capitol Hill, however, and I spent, since I had to deal with committees and there were the majority and the minority, whoever, depended the administration, basically if they were Democratic or Republican, that was quite interesting. Some congressional committees, they work together really well. They talk to each other. Others, they sit separately when you go into a meeting with them. They don't share with each other and they're kind of competitive and things like that. So particularly when they're preparing for a hearing, because if it's a topic where the Republicans are favorable towards whatever the hearing is about, you'll get kind of thrown these easy questions and they'll talk to you. They'll tell you what their questions are. If it's someone who's not, if they're against whatever it is you're coming to testify about, they don't like to share the questions. They don't want to they want to surprise you or your boss who's having to answer them. So it's much more partisan on the Hill, and it's gotten worse. So
I would imagine it's gotten worse.
yeah.
Judy's question is, based on your years in the NSA and Homeland Security, is there anyone you came to admire in particular, in addition to Dick Cheney?
Well, that wasn't an admiring thing. Oh gosh. There were a lot of people I came to admire. I mean, starting with when I was young, there were a number of people, men and women, but particularly women that I really looked up to, who showed me the ropes, showed me I could be who I wanted to be, and not to be afraid to speak up. So there were, people like that. Later on, I mean, we all admired Tom Ridge, because yes, he was a Republican governor who came to be the head of Homeland Security, but he was just an all around, let's get this done together, and was very accessible and wanted always to do the right thing. So probably my favorite boss, just in general of being that accepting and getting everyone behind him to get something done. So yeah, I just saw a lot of people I admired, even in the intelligence. The last director of national intelligence, Jim Clapper, who you actually see, he's been on the news an awful lot. He retired, he was a Army general. He retired, he kind of had it, but he was asked to come back in federal service. And so he spent, many years as the DNI. He retired me, did a retirement ceremony for me. And he's just, and he continues to speak up. So I admire those people, regardless, who will speak up for the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Sue asks, when you were still working, was artificial intelligence beginning to be a threat to national security?
Yes, it was definitely a topic. I even remember I was part of this government-wide, we called it a computer working group, meaning we were looking at computer and cyber things. And artificial intelligence came into play early on. And I remember actually had a trip to Ohio where we went to, I don't know, it was Cincinnati Millicron. It was somewhere anyhow where we actually got demos on how artificial intelligence worked and such, because people were trying to look ahead to see how is this going to impact national security.
Interesting. Other questions out there? We have a few more minutes. You can just start talking or you could type them in the chat, either one.
The question is, what would you like to be doing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, when I left the government, I just didn't want to be scheduled anymore. it was just every minute was it was just busy. So I guess when I left the government and retired from federal service, I really didn't have any desire to have another job. And so as far as, looking ahead, I really, and both my husband and I mean, we like to spend time together, but besides kind of the regular day-to-day things, I still really like music and such. And so I think, we're looking for ways where we can support musicians, and basically just looking at the world of music and how we can help other people achieve what they want to do. But other than that, I have to admit, I guess I'm a little more me oriented, because I spent so many years not really being able to have the time to do that. So, and the other thing that I always enjoy, and I actually still do, I still keep in contact with people, that worked for me kind of as a mentor and that sort of thing. So I enjoy doing that, but otherwise it's just kind of to live my life as a private citizen and do the things I'm interested in.
Yeah, because it seems to me like it was really 110% investment of everything, like emotionally, intellectually, your life. Like it seems like it was a lot.
It was, and I had a very understanding and patient husband who, if I wanted to do something, it was fine. I wanted to go off to Germany for a couple months because I wanted to experience what it was like working overseas. Okay, because and so I've been very fortunate, but it really took me a really long time to decompress from all of that, and I didn't realize that. I didn't realize kind of that it was you're tense more of the time because you're constantly have to be on and things. So it's taken me quite a while to kind of get back to find myself. Who is that person? Who's that person who left Madison?
Right. And so much pressure, I was just thinking about just the pressure that even as a young student or, recent grad, translating and that kind of, that's intense. That's a lot of pressure to get things right and it's very inspiring. I think what you've been able to accomplish and what you've done and created for yourself and as a woman in government, I'm really, really inspired and impressed.
Oh, thank you.
I knew all that about you, but it was really great of you to share your experiences. It was really illuminating.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate all the questions and the conversation.
But thank you so much, Sue and Jennifer and everybody for participating. This was truly a learning experience for all of us, learning about our government, but about Sue and how she's made it so important. And I hope Iris and Dan have enjoyed learning too. But again, here's somebody who from Madison who took advantage of every opportunity she had and just thank you so much for doing this and for helping all of us and helping the government using your common sense.
Well, the good news is there's a lot of other people out there like me, so that's good.
Well, you could consider writing a memoir in this next chapter too.
This is your next step now, your memoir. But thank you all for participating. And Jennifer, thank you for being the guru. And thank you all and have a good Shabbat Shalom and a pleasant day now.
Thank you all for planning this. It was a wonderful program.
Yes, thank you. It was a great program.
And Sue, you said you're not used to talking about yourself, but you did a beautiful job narrating your
thank you.
Experiences. It was really great. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Okay.
Retirement.
Thanks. Okay,
All
bye.
right.